Are you guys ready? Let us jump into our study today. Finally getting into, well, I say finally, we did in fact get into some study. We got at least 3 or 4 words into 1 John 1:1 last time, which is an excellent start. So I want to, today my little title for today is Concerning the Word of Life, because that's what I think things are clear. Well, okay, I was going to say what things are clearly about, though we still don't hit the main subject and verb of the sentence, of course, in this first verse. But what I want to do is I want to let's look back over verse 1. What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. So you see that within that first set of sort of like nesting set of, it's not even nesting clauses. They're like a series of clauses, right? All of these things, series of noun clauses, all of these things concerning the word of life. All of them are connected to the word of life, right? The word of life is the sort of climax, syntactically speaking, right, of that first verse, right? So that's clearly what we are supposed to focus on, what we're supposed to think about. Now, again, I would emphasize this is not the main idea of the sentence yet, right? We're not at the subject and verb. So we haven't hit the independent clause, and we're not gonna until we get down to verse 3, right? And we'll come back to that. Of course, we're gonna have to come back to verse 1 and look at this. Verse 2, as who knows, maybe we'll get there today. I don't really know. But if we get there, we'll see 2 is parenthetical, right? And so then in verse 3, we resume and get to the independent clause. But the word of life. So this, of course, picks up on what we were saying last time. What we were saying last time about the significance of the beginning, right? We started talking about the beginning, which peeking over to my Greek, which I have sitting over here on the side. As always. And by the way, holy cow, this is so cool. I mean, I totally forgot to put a link to this on my webpage. I meant to do that. I'll do that. Anyway, I'll put up a link to this. So this is the Bible Hub is the .com is the website here. And this is so cool. I could lose myself for days on this thing, because not only does it have does it parse it for you and everything, but what I discovered almost I'd been really enjoying the mouse over part, right? I can mouse over these things and it'll tell me what the words are from and everything. But if you click on the word, it takes you to the concordance. Where you can see where this word is used everywhere else. Oh my goodness, that's incredible. But wait, it gets even cooler. You click on the number at the top, and the number is the number from Strong's Concordance, and it gives you the whole part of speech and word studies and references in lots of other places. So cool. Oh my goodness, I can't even handle it. So anyway, this is, I told you guys last time, I don't know Greek, and I'm interested in learning Greek, and just kind of being able to sort of crawl around in here is really helpful. Now, you're right, Aiden. We don't get from this information about how the words are used outside the Bible. That would be really helpful too. So I agree. That would be a really useful supplement to see other ways in which those words are used, especially contemporaneously. Because my understanding is that the Greek that the New Testament authors are generally writing in, it's not exactly street Greek precisely, but it's the Greek that has been adapted for a common language, especially in the eastern half of the Mediterranean, these are all first century Jews, speaking from within the Jewish culture, the Jewish cultural context, and therefore also often quoting the Septuagint, right, the Greek Old Testament translation, which they knew very well. Yeah, exactly. It's a Greek as spoken by native Aramaic speakers, Aiden. Exactly. Yeah. It's a common speech. It's simpler in some ways, as that's always been my understanding. Yeah. Anyway, but I don't want to get to the language can be a temptation for me. Like I don't want to sidetrack too much and talk about just the language itself. But it's important for us to keep in mind kind of where we're coming from here. But anyway, back to the beginning. What was from the beginning? And though we were saying last time, I'm not going to talk too much about connections. We're not going to do a whole lot of chasing around throughout the entire Bible and stuff. I really want to focus in on what John is doing internally and the vocabulary that he's building internally. But as I said last time, the very first phrase I can't skip. I can't avoid the connections there. Because especially when it turns out that what was from the beginning is the Word, right? Which, of course, thinking back to John 1:1, the very beginning of John's Gospel, and the beginning was the Word, which, of course, itself looks back to Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created. So that we are appealing in that direction seems pretty clear. The Greek word is the same, arche, there, as well as the word for word there, right? Concerning the logon, here, logon tes zoes, the word of life. As I thought, syntactically, word is genitive here, which is peri is the conjunction there concerning the word of life, and that is the sense that I had from the English translation from the New American Standard concerning the word of life. It's so these noun clauses are all things that are about the word of that are of the word of life. It is the kind of the anchor at the end of that series of noun clauses. So on the one hand, we get what was from the beginning and the word, like John 1:1, but it's not the same, right? John 1:1 is beginning, in the beginning was the word, and the word did a whole bunch of other things, right? And it talks explicitly about the relationship between the word and God and all that stuff, right? That's what John does at the beginning of the gospel. That's not what we're doing here. We're recalling that, right? So when we get what was from the beginning, we also get the word, but he's not doing that same thing, right? What is this first verse about? It's what was from the beginning concerning the word of life. It's not the same as the word in the beginning was the word. Notice how much more straightforward that is in John 1:1. Yeah. So, yeah. Do you see what I mean? What was from the beginning concerning the word of life? I'm skipping the stuff in the middle because I'm trying to see the shape of how those noun clauses fit with that last phrase concerning the word of life. Do you see what I mean by that? So something is going on. It's not just that the word is doing something here, right? And it's not just a statement that the word was there from the beginning. It is alluding to something that was from the beginning concerning the word of life. And that suggests to me that he's using the word beginning in more than one sense here, right? There is clearly the echo of the capital B beginning, right? The big beginning, the Genesis 1:1, John 1:1 beginning, right? But I think that there's clearly more than that here. And that sounds funny to say. Like, what do you mean more beginning than the beginning of everything, right? I mean that I think he's using that word in more than one sense, right? that he wants us to be thinking, I think, about creation, about the beginning, creation, and the word's involvement in the creation. He's embedded that, I think, for a reason. But I think that that's not the topic of this verse, right? But before I skip over here, because it's kind of a big deal, word of life. I didn't necessarily see that coming. I remember... It's not hard to remember. In some ways, I feel like when I came back and was studying this book recently, it was almost like I read it for the first time. I have like all these memories of like, my reactions upon seeing it for the first time from, last like November or something, because although I've read this book many times before in the context of reading through the Bible, as I've said, I've never understood it. And it always just kind of rolled past me, in part because I read it way too fast. I would usually read 1 John in a sitting when I was doing my like read through the Bible stretches and stuff. And it's just like, it would roll past me or over me, and I would just be like, huh? And then in places where I have looked, I mean, there are other passages that I remember from years past, passages that came up in maybe other Bible studies that I was in or something like that, and like where everybody just kind of like slowly backs away and like, tries to like, because there are a whole bunch of verses in this epistle that like often Christians come across, and they do that. They like back slowly away in a non-threatening manner, hoping it won't spring, right? And we'll get to some of those. Anyway, remembering this, the word of life was one of the things that kind of surprised me, that really struck me there, because I was expecting the word. Like when I got what was from the beginning, I was waiting for the word to come. But then I got the word of life. And that seems to me another really important thing, going back to the Greek here for a minute. Logo tes zoes, or to logo tes zoes. And I apologize for my pronunciation. I've never learned how to pronounce Greek. I'm making things up. Zoe. Zoe is the noun, the life noun here, and that I know to be important. And this is definitely one of the words that I want to be making sure that we are keeping track of. There are several pieces of vocabulary, and we'll be building this as we go through. Let me actually peek ahead for a minute here. I got my other versions, and we can refer to those. But I started a little chart of our word list, building our Johannine vocabulary, and I want to be adding words to this as we go, words that we want to make sure that we're keeping track of, because by noticing them and how he uses them as we move along is how we're going to be able to get a sense for what he means by that, and the significance of those and the kinds of concepts that he's bringing into contact with each other by his different usages of there. So now, I didn't include logos on here. I can be convinced, but and here, like, of course, we're in verse 1, so what I'm adding to the word list, I'm like completely cheating, basically using my memory of the rest of the book, and so I'm coming across these words in 1:1 and saying, like, I can remember, at least half a dozen, if not more, places where this is going to come up and be very, very important in many, many future places in the book. Logos is crucial, but he doesn't use it as often. It comes up, but not as much as, say, Zoe. Zoe is, and I would also add, when he does use the word, when he does use logos, he often tends to just kind of bring it in, like when he says in, what is it, chapter 4? Yeah, chapter 5. In chapter 5, right, there are three in heaven that bear witness in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one, right? The great Trinitarian verse. He tosses off the word there in the Trinitarian list, right? So obviously that's important. It's not like that's not important, right? But but again, it's not. He's not using that word persistently. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I was overlooking them, or maybe even the English translation I was looking at concealed it. It's another thing. It's another reason why I want to keep anchoring us to the Greek, because of course there are particular words that when translated into English, either a single word will get translated in multiple different ways. So there is a repetition that the English hides, or sometimes the English will create a repetition that isn't there in the Greek. So I want to keep it kind of, that's why I have English and Greek there, to make sure that we're kind of thinking about those. Yeah, Matthew, that's exactly what I am thinking too, that adding Zoe in the genitive afterwards, right? He's not only speaking of the word, but the word of life. He is, I think, developing those themes in a new direction, and connecting from the beginning. What we have is, and let me go back to my word list. It's pretty simple here. And by the way, we're going to be we can be making notes and adding things to that list as we live here. I'm gonna willing to edit that page. That's why I left blank spots there if we need to. But the word of life, like that phrase, life is where the verse ends, right? It's a genitive. It's sort of it's clarifying, but that genitive, by the way, for those of you who haven't done much language study of this kind, the genitive case just means the possessive case. It's not only used with possessives, as we can see. Both of these verbs, this is genitive masculine singular or genitive feminine singular, both logo and zoes are both in the genitive because this preposition takes the genitive, or when this preposition takes the genitive, it can take the genitive and it means certain things. That's how an inflected language will show meaning and syntax that way. But in general, the genitive, it's like the apostrophe s. It's the possessive case of a noun. Which, of course, in the case of life, gets represented there. It makes word of life a thing, like a single thing together, a single concept. But it also makes let me use the possessive as an example. When you say, a really simple possessive of ownership, right? Like Joe's boots, right? You say Joe's boots. The primary noun is Joe, right? The primary noun is boots, right? Like, I picked up Joe's boots. What did you pick up? You picked up the boots. Right, it's the actions about the boots, right? So what is the word Joe's, the genitive word there? What is it doing? It's a possessive. It's ultimately working like an adjective describing the boot. Which boots? Joe's boots, right? The boots of Joe. It's giving you information about that primary noun. So there's a way in which these two words join together, word and life, there. As genitives like that. Genitive can define. That's a good way of thinking about it, Tom. And can I just say how wonderful it is to have so many people in here who know so much more about Greek than I do. I would be completely at sea without help. But yes, genitive can define. So the word of life can mean the word that is life. Yes, exactly. And that's exactly, Tom, the way that it feels to me, like the way that this whole thing seems to go. It's it defines the life that he's talking about, in a sense, right? But it also defines the word that he's talking about. These two things are intimately bound together, life and the word. And honestly, that would be in my top 3 summaries of this entire epistle. That the word life is of the Word, and that the Word is of life. Both of those things are, I think, absolutely central to what John is doing here. So noting their connection together, it's not just the Word. And I feel a twinge every time I say that phrase. It's not just the Word, right? It's not just the Logos. I mean, like, whatever. I'm not being slighting, of course, in saying just the Word. I'm saying he's adding this important concept to it. From the beginning, he is attaching the concept of life, Zoe, to the Word himself, right? We don't yet have the name Jesus used, right? Connected to the Word. We're going to get Jesus, of course, at the end of verse 3. But this is, of course, enormously essential for John. But this is where I do think Matthew, as you were suggesting before, he's kind of taking what was said there in John 1:1, and he's sort of adding a new dimension. He's going a different direction with it, right? We're thinking about this. Springboarding, that's a perfectly fine way to think about that. So yeah, it is almost like a synonym praise. I think that's fair to say, that he is coupling those two ideas, the Logos and the Zoe, almost as intimately as that. One of my general observations about the pattern of thought in 1 John, I feel like it reminds me of Sesame Street episodes of my youth, where like this episode was brought to you by the letter G and the number 4, right? I feel like the first epistle of John is brought to you by the transitive property in math, right? The transitive property, as you may recall, is like if one thing is equal to another thing, and they're both equal to a third thing, then those things are equal to each other, right? John is constantly going around saying, this is this, like what I just did, like how I switched, the word of, the word of life, it's the life of the Word, and the word of life. John does that kind of thing all the time. And we're going to see him doing this constantly. There will be frequent occasions as we discuss this epistle when he's going to be saying things and we may be hoping he's about to tell us, like, he's like kind of wrapping these concepts together without really defining them. And then he's going to connect them to another thing, which we may hope is going to bring us to like a third thing that will help us understand those things. And instead, he's just going to link them back to each other again. That's just, it's how it works. It's how this epistle works. It's how he thinks. So thinking about Word and life together there, we see that. 'Cause notice, again, if we know John 1:1, we would think that the Word is the important thing here, right? When we get what was from the beginning and then we finally get to the Word, we might be like, okay, so we're talking about the Word, right? But look where he goes immediately in verse 2. Is he talking about the Word? No, he's talking about life. And the life was manifested, right? So speaking of the life, let me tell you more about the life, right? And it was like, oh, okay, so it's not just about the Word. It's about the Word of life. And then he goes on to talk about the life. And it was the life in verse 2 that is going to be seen like that which was from the beginning was being seen and heard and looked upon there in verse 1. So again, there's a way in which he's taking these two concepts and he's bringing them very, very close in that first idea. And that's the first thing I think that we need to kind of ground ourselves on. The connection between the Word and life. And again, going now back, all the way back to the arche, right? Back to Genesis 1. That, of course, is not a surprising connection, right? That the whole creation process, is, the ordering and vivification of things. We start off with, the Word being wild and waste, right? Being empty and void, being what's that marvelous Hebrew phrase? Tohu vavohu. Isn't that the Hebrew phrase there in Genesis 1? Anyway, but then of course we get all of these additions and orderings, and of course culminating in the latter days, right, in days 5 and 6, with life, with teeming life. And then of course you have the breathing of the breath of life into Adam there, into Adam, into the person, in chapter 2. So anyway, this connection between from word through creation, back to creation through John 1:1 and Genesis 1:1, that link between the word and life, between that power of the word of God, of God's speaking in creation, the link between that and life is easy to see, and we can see that John is really resting on that there. And I agree, Randall, that the identification of word and life is even more strongly suggested there in the second verse. Agreed. Matthew, hang on, I'm going to save that one for a second. And remind me, Matthew, if we when we're discussing verse 2, if I haven't gone right, Matthew's doing cool thing with the word manifested, and I want to come back to that. But I'm peeking ahead at verse 2, which is irresponsible because we're not done with verse 1 yet. Especially the way that this is kind of chunked, right? Verse 1 is its own thing, that is the set of noun clauses, and then we get the parenthetical in verse 2, and then we get the rest of the independent clause in verse 3. And so that's why the verses themselves, the verse divisions are they're not authorial, right? They're not original. So we don't have to bind ourselves to the verse divisions, but these make good sense to me as a way to split them up. And although I skipped over the stuff in the middle there, I don't want to, in verse 1, I don't want to leave it behind entirely. So let's do the middle. What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. So again, rather than John 1:1, where we get in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Again, these statements, startling enough statements, but clear, syntactically clear statements, right, about the Word and who the Word is and what the Word was and how long the Word's been around and all that kind of thing. Here we get what was from the beginning, and then we immediately start with the we's, right? He's not writing in the third person singular. He's not writing about the Word. He's writing about us. And we talked about the plural here. All of these verbs are clearly plural. The hearing and seeing, right? Like peeking back over at our Greek here. Heard is plural, and seen is plural, and gazed upon is plural, and handled down here is plural. So yeah, we got all these plural verbs going on, right? First person plural. So it's all about the action, the repeated actions here. Well, no, they're not repeated. They're all different actions, sort of. Is us. These are all things that we have done concerning the word of life. Heard, seen, looked at, touched. The first one. That's the most striking thing to me, I think. I think that was the bit. I kind of had my mind blown twice in the first verse, as I recall, when I sat down with this in November, October, whenever it was. The one I've already mentioned, the word of life, that I didn't expect the tag along there. I didn't expect the add-on to word. But what we have heard. Because I knew that word was coming, right? And I had been used to thinking of the connection between the divine word that John is speaking of in the Gospel, and the Genesis connection, right? And God's creative power speaking the world into being and speaking the world into order. as we see in Genesis 1. And of course, so I'd been used to thinking of those two things together, right? But then here in this first two phrases of 1 John 1:1, John asks us to take that concept and to think of it in a completely new way, right? The divine word speaking into the void, right? The divine word speaking over creation to shape and form it. We've heard that word. That divine word has entered into not just the darkness and made light, right? Not just the wild and waste world and made order. It's spoken into our ear canals, right? Into our minds. We have received the word, right? Yeah, Matthew, exactly. Matthew, of course, is recalling the famous sort of climax of the beginning of that opening in John's gospel, right? And the word was made flesh and dwelt among us, right? Having said all of these things about the word, he then ends with that kind of, shocking statement, right? Then the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And as Matthew says, he's really kind of leaning into that here, right? And giving us a completely new way to think. Because it's not, yes, he did. But there's another sense in which, right, like we get the hearing before we get the touching with our hands, right? It is, of course, like the fact that we could hear, see, look at, touch the word of life emphasizes the fact that he was made flesh, right? He's talking about the incarnate Jesus in those first verses. But there's also a sense in which, again, that the word, it's the first thing we get is we heard, right? What was from the beginning. Attentive readers will know already what was from the beginning was the word, right? What was from the beginning, the word that we have heard. It's like, whoa. I mean, I'm used to thinking of like creation as like the audience, the recipient of the word, right? But here from the beginning, John seems to embed this idea that that word has been spoken into our ears. That just as the word acts in creation in John 1:1, so it is acting in our minds and hearts now. And that word is the word of life. So I found that kind of a mind-blowing readjustment of thinking of the way I've thought about the word, because the Gospel John word stuff, those first 14 verses of chapter 1 are so big, huge theological claims about God and about the word and explaining all this stuff. And here John just jumps right in with this is personal. This is personal. This is a personal encounter. That word which has been speaking from the beginning, we've heard it. We've heard it. It's personal. Like it's to say, I have heard the word, right? And to say, I have met Jesus. My hands touched him, right? Those things are combined together here. The word of life has been spoken straight into our minds and hearts. Now, what do you guys make of the seeing? In particular, the doubling there. What we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands. So we get hearing, seeing, and touching, but we get seeing twice. And when I go to the Greek, it seems that the NASB, my go-to literal translation here, seems to be doing a reasonably good job at that. So we have the two words for seeing, right? Heorakamen is our first scene, and then gazed upon. Ethiosametha, Samatha. We've got the eyes, the ophthalmos, connected with the seeing, right? So like the first emphasis seems to be anchoring it in the literal, right? What we have heard, what we have seen, and then there's almost like this that the with our eyes phrase seems almost like a parenthetical to say, and I mean seen people. I'm not speaking metaphorically. I'm not saying, oh yes, I see that. No. Like our actual physical eyeballs saw it, right? Yeah. Cool. Tom says the second word, the second Greek word, the gazed upon word, translated looked at, and I think the King James does looked upon. Yeah, that's what I thought. Tom says that has more to do with looking and watching. It's related to theater. It's like what somebody would do at a theater, not just seeing but looking and watching. So would it be fair to say seeing with our eyes is establishing the physical fact of viewing, right? And then going and adding the gazing upon, the looking upon, that like we didn't only see it, we watched it, right? That is to say, we were paying attention. This isn't just like I saw somebody and then later on I realized it was this person, but like this was something we were watching. And yeah, there are several of you who are remembering, the things like gospel references, both with the ears part earlier on, those who have ears to hear, but also as Carrie says, they are walking with Jesus and do not see. There's like blessed are those who have not seen but believed, and yes. Oh, cool, David. Yeah, I just quoted Jesus's words to Thomas, right? Blessed are those who have not seen and believed, to doubting Thomas after the resurrection. And David was just saying, our hands have handled calls to mind Thomas, feeling the wounds of the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, it does. And Devorah, I agree with you. Focused attention, I think, is a good way to differentiate there. Like the difference between hearing and listening. I think that's a really good comparison. Yeah, Matthew says it's like the inverse of those who have eyes but see not. Yes, exactly. They had eyes, right? And they also saw, right? What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. That touched with our hands at the end is an important emphasis, right? And again, it follows along, like what was from the beginning, the word, what we have heard, and it is connected to us, right? We have heard that word was spoken into us, and not just, we didn't just like hear about it. We heard the word. We've seen it with our eyes. We didn't just like metaphorically see it. We didn't just understand it. We didn't just, we've seen it. We looked at it, right? We watched it. We paid attention, right? And we touched it with our hands. We confirmed it was real. The word was made flesh, and we encountered it directly. Very much more intimate, Emily. Very much. There's a very clear sense of intimacy there in the touched with our hands. You can do any of the other things, hearing, seeing, even looking at in a crowd, right? Touched with our. Is much more personal there. Carol Lynn, what a fascinating observation. I hadn't thought of that. But Carol says, is the order of actions here in the same order in which the disciples found out about Jesus' resurrection? Hearing, the voice. I know that's how it happens in Revelation. Do they hear first? I guess they hear from the angel, and then see, and then actually look at, right? Like when Mary sees him and thinks he's the gardener, right? She's seen him, but she didn't really gaze at him, right? She didn't really look at him. Then she looks at him, right? And then she can't handle him yet, right? And then he gets handled later on. The disciples hear from the women, right? Yes, that's I was including the women in that actually, but yeah. But if you think about it from the disciples' standpoint, from the John perspective, if we assume that this was the apostle who wrote this, which, as I said last time, I'm not hugely invested in debates about the identity of the person who wrote this. But certainly the claim to have touched Jesus with his hands certainly seems to put it in an apostolic framework. Yeah, interesting. Matthew says it also tracks with what we see at the beginning of the Gospel of John, when he first starts meeting folks. Remember, like Nathaniel and others there in John 1, they hear what Jesus said, and then Jesus tells them to come and see. Right? So, yeah. Yes. I think that it does seem to me. I mean, I don't know that we need necessarily invest too much in any of these specific parallels. Like, I don't think that this necessarily means like he's referring to the discovery of the resurrection, or he's referring to the discovery of Jesus and realizing that he was the Christ at the beginning. I think that it's kind of all of those things, right? Or rather, let me say this another way. This begins to help me see why he's presented this as a series of parallel noun clauses instead of just saying this stuff, right? He gives these things separately. There is a kind of progression here, right? It is clearly a progression of increasing intimacy and understanding, hearing, and then seeing with your eyes, and then looking at, really observing, right? Really paying attention to, and then that, Emily, just as you said, that closest level of intimacy, that touching with your hands, right? That kind of progression does map onto all of those things, right? Whether it be, the initial encounter with Jesus at, in the earlier parts of the Gospels, or whether it be that discovery of the resurrection, after, at the end of the Gospels, that same kind of pattern of drawing nearer and nearer to the word of life seems to be one of the things that's happening here in this verse, right? That gets kind of dramatized in the way that he lays out these verb clauses. And then again, going back to the start of the verse, what was from the beginning, right? So we start really far away, right? What was from the beginning, it's almost like what we have contemplated, right? Because we weren't there in the very beginning, right? That thing which we have thought about. Just as, and again, I think back about the, what was I saying? The beginning of the gospel, Matthew, as we were just discussing. When the disciples, or soon to be disciples, hear Jesus and encounter Jesus for the first time, they're thinking about, they already have a concept, right? They're waiting for the Messiah. Like, they know about the Christ, and so like the news is not like, dude, did you hear there was going to be a Messiah? Right? That's not the news. The news is like, this is him, right? The Messiah is totally right over there, right? That's the message that we're getting at. So in a sense, that what was from the beginning is like, it's that concept, right? Like we have, so again, in one sense, you could almost sort of like that first phrase, almost that first noun clause serves almost to be this like, what we have contemplated, what we have known about, right? What we have thought about, and then what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. I think that's pretty cool. So back to the we. It is possible, of course, that by saying what we have heard, we have seen, we have looked at, and touched with our hands, it is possible that he is speaking on behalf of the apostles, right? That this is a statement of firsthand, of a firsthand witness, right? And there were others, right? There were multiple witnesses, and so he is bearing witness to this on behalf of himself and the other apostles. I can tell you, we've heard it, we've seen it, we looked upon it, we handled it with our hands. And that's what I'm going to tell you about. Devora, it does establish credibility. Great question. Carrie is asking, and I'm going to throw this immediately to my Greek scholars, Tom and Aidan and Matthew and others. The first person plural. Of course, we often think of the royal we. It's funny how much Americans think about the royal we. We don't do that in America, but Americans are always thinking about the royal we, it seems to me. It comes up a lot. And a surprising amount. I always liked Mark Twain's saying that there are only three people who can use the first person plural about themselves, and that's royalty, newspaper editorial writers, and people with tapeworms. In Greek, how do they do it? Is that a thing in Greek? The plural, like the first person plural, does one use the first person plural in Greek? Not necessarily to establish in a royal context, but is there a kind of a literary trope for using the first person plural to establish some as a position of authority or something like that? Some kind of rhetorical usage essentially of the first person plural. I'd be interested in learning more ways about that. Interesting. Not often is what I'm getting from a lot of people. Do we get that in other? Anyway, let me start off with, I can see two other ways to understand this. Well, okay, I can see three ways right away to understand the first person plural here. One is in the rhetorical way that I was just pointing to, the way that in English we tend to hear that a lot for some reason, more than it's actually appropriately used, for sure. A bunch of people are saying in biblical literature they don't recall that being used in that way. Joe, what a wonderful question, which I was just about to ask, and which Carrie was just following up with asking as well. Any Hebrew scholars? Anybody know Hebrew or Aramaic? Aidan, do you have any Aramaic? Is that a thing in Aramaic? Because, of course, even if it weren't a thing in normal Greek, right, somebody who's thinking in Aramaic and translating into Greek might, maybe, if it were a thing in Aramaic or in Hebrew. Yes, there is the famous use of God using the plural in the Old Testament. Let us make man according to our image and that kind of thing. Yes. The prophets use we. Sometimes, I think, the prophets, I think, generally use we when they're speaking on behalf of the people, right? Like that when they're talking about like Israel collectively, right? So I think it's like the collective we in that sense. well, I don't want to go down too deep a rabbit hole. I'm going to then, so as I said, three ways in which I can understand the we. One is that some kind of potentially rhetorical usage of it. The other would be, as I already mentioned, him speaking on behalf of the plural apostles, right? Those establishing, Devora, as you said, establishing credibility, right? I saw this and touched, and it's not just me, right? Is one other sense of it. But I think that the third way would be to be including his readers as well. That when he says we, he means me and you, like the most immediate and, in a sense, obvious we involved here is him and his readers, right? The other apostles are tangential, right? And it's not relevant, but he's not talking to them, right? And they're not standing next to him, right? In fact, they're all dead now, right? Pretty much. I think, assuming this is the Apostle John, he's the last one standing at this point. So yeah, I think that may be an element, right? There may be this element of like recollection, like I remember when, we heard, saw, looked at, touched. But he seems to be, it seems to me, very likely or most directly to be including his readers as well. What we have heard, you and I. We do, now you're right, we're going to get different pronouns later on, right? We are going to get a you and an us in verse 3, right? Yeah. So we are gonna get our second person pronouns coming in there. Yeah. But which would call into question that third reading of we in verse 1, right? Why would he be including his readers in the we in verse 1 when he's clearly differentiating his readers, the you, in verse 3, and still using we, right? Doesn't separate it into I and, start with we and separate to I and you, right? He's doing we and you there in verse 3. Let's just double check, but I feel confident that they did this right. Yep. We have seen, we declare to you, yes, there we are, second person, and first person plural still. So, yep. That would seem to say, well, that's clearly then not what's going on in verse 1, right? I'm still not convinced, actually. I'm still not convinced, in a sense. 1 second, coming back to the, because I don't want to leave that hanging completely. The reference to the God's using the plural in the Old Testament. As several people were pointing out, that is unusual. God does that, but as it's an exception when it happens on several occasions, several very notable occasions. Genesis 1, Genesis 3, Tower of Babel. It happens several times, and it's very important and interesting. In several of the Psalms, we get that as well. It comes up, but it's not like it's a standard rhetorical trope or something. Like when it's being used, it seems to me that when that's happening in the Old Testament, like there's a thing going on there like this, and it's not just like, oh, I'm just using plural cause, like you do, right? Like it's not a like you do kind of thing. And you can tell in those passages by the way it shifts back and forth. God shifts back and forth between the first person plural and first person singular in mid-speech at several points in some of those passages, like in Genesis 1:1. Anyway, I just wanted, I acknowledge that that's a really interesting kind of connection, but I don't think it really bears on this because those they seem to be doing a particular thing, and this is not that thing for sure. This is not God speaking of himself in the third person. So we'll we'll get there. We'll get there. Okay. But we'll see. We'll see. I'm going to pause it, and for now, see, it's hard because I'm cheating. I'm doing all kinds of cheating. I'm cheating all day long here in this session so far because we've been first completely going back to John 1 all the way through, like I said I wasn't going to do, and now I'm going back to Genesis 2. And secondly, I'm peeking ahead. That's what the other thing I mean by cheating. I'm peeking ahead, and my reading ahead in 1 John suggests to me that he's using the inclusive we here. So all I can do is just kind of put a little flag in that and say, let's come back to this. Let's come back to this, because I think that when we see more of how John is building this and the kind of things that he's saying and the way that he's sort of, the message that he's conveying, I believe that I will be prepared to argue later, though we'll see. Maybe I'll change my mind, but I believe I will be prepared to argue that he's using the inclusive we deliberately there. That he's doing two things at the same time here. He is testifying to what he himself is. He is making a claim as an eyewitness and a hand witness and an ear witness, right, of Jesus, of the manifested word of life. But he's also including them. He's also saying, you too are a part of that. And again, here I come back to arche, what was from the beginning. And remember, as we said last time, there are several different senses of that. What was from the beginning, in the sense of from the beginning of time, right? From creation was the word. But there's more than one sense of that, right? It's also what was from the beginning, like from the beginning of this whole story, like from the beginning of the gospel story, right? From the incarnation, right? What we have heard, this chapter, this message that I'm telling you began at the time when the word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we touched it and heard it and looked upon it and stuff, right? That's, I think, another sense of beginning. He's talking about the beginning of the word of life, the beginning of this Zoe thing. But I think there's a third sense of the word beginning, and that's linked directly to the we's, directly to those first person plurals. There's another beginning that's relevant here, and that's the beginning of his relationship with his readers, right? It is very clear from what we will see later on in this text that although this is called the first epistle of John, he's not writing to strangers. Some of them are, right? Some of the epistles are clearly writing to, like Paul's writing to the Romans, and he's never been to Rome yet, right? He'll get there, but he hasn't been there yet, right? Peter is writing, and he's clearly writing to a bunch of people that he's never met before, right? Whereas you get something like 1 Corinthians, and Paul is clearly writing to people. He explicitly talks about having met them in the time that he spent with them before, right? John doesn't get all episodic. He doesn't get, there are quasi-narrative bits in some of those letters of Paul, like 1 Corinthians, right, where we hear about, things like where Paul is like, I'm glad I didn't baptize anybody there except for and I can't remember if I baptized anybody else when I was there. That's what I mean by those like narrative bits that we get in some of Paul's epistles. And John doesn't get John doesn't get narrative in that way about his audience, but he will make it very clear that he knows the people that he's talking to, or at least that they have been connected before. And that, I think, is a third relevance of the concept of the arche, of the beginning. What was from the beginning. To do a little spoiler for later on, the word arche is going to come up a lot, and when it does come up, it's usually going to refer to this third time that I'm talking about. What we heard from the beginning, that is the original gospel message that you received, is the number one way, and I think it's the number one by number off the top of my head. I haven't counted, but that's the way in which that phrase, that word arche, is going to come up again and again throughout 1 John. So I can't help but read this in that context. And yes, I agree, Tom. That sense of having been there from the beginning also does establish authority. Yeah. Oh, interesting. So, Tom, I didn't know that pun. The word arche also means govern. Oh, like archon. Right. Yeah. Ruler. Yeah. Never thought of that. Right. Like archbishop. That's where it comes from. Of course. Yeah. Arche. Right. So we should see if we hear, to appropriately mix all of my sound metaphors here, we should see if we can hear resonance of authority involved there. And I think we can. That sounds right to me. Here. Yeah, first in rank in a list. Right. Yeah. First, foremost. Yeah. Oh, man. That suggests an entirely different reading, like another reading of that first noun clause then. If we read it arche, not as beginning, but as first, foremost, right? Premier, right? Primary. What was, or even, Tom, as you suggest, monarch, right? What was from the monarch? Right, that which was, like, this has been delivered. This comes from the top, is another way in which to understand that. Right, not just this came from the start, right, but this comes straight from the top would be a really clumsy way to paraphrase that. What was from the beginning, what we've heard, what we've seen, what we've looked at, all of those things that have been observed by us it comes from a position of authority, right? I never thought of that. That's really useful. I know, yeah, and you're right, Matthew's right to remind me to be cautious. Just because a word has multiple meanings doesn't mean that you always think of them all every time you use the word. That's true. But, Matthew, my counter to that would be, you do when you're writing and reading poetry. And I don't know anything about Aramaic poetry, and I know little enough about Greek poetry. But the way this entire sentence works is intensely poetic. Poetic in the sense I was saying last time, that it seems to me poetic in the sense that it is not making statements. This is not prose. Like, prose tries to explain things clearly. Mostly. That's awkward, and many examples when it's not. But poetry brings words and concepts together and allows multiple meanings and multiple senses of them to play. You don't have to choose. Again, it's the reason why you can never translate poetry. You can never truly translate poetry from one language to another. It's not possible, because you have to make choices which a poem itself resists making. Like, the whole nature of a poem is to resist those choices, to place two words, each of which has multiple potential resonances, and to bring those two things into contact, right? And then they kind of achieve this resonance which, does other things that are not contained within the meaning of either word, right? Like that's what poetry does. That's how poetry works in essence, I think, anyway. And like, poetry, you're supposed to think about, meditate on, taste, just experience in lots of different ways. It's not merely expository. It's not just trying to convey to you a concept, like prose so very often does. But anyway, everything I can see about how he's constructing his sentences and how he's putting things together suggests to me that John is doing a similar kind of thing. I think one of the things, like just from verse 1, alone, I come out with a very clear impression that we should be very careful. We should be very careful about emerging with what we feel like is the reading. Like this is the thing that he's saying in this verse or with this word. Because I don't think there is a thing. I think that he is... so I'm going to be more interested in seeing what are the things that are kind of being held in tension. Is such an English teacher way to say it, but there's a reason English teachers say that. I think it's sloppy though often, because I've used that phrase so many times, but it's, as an English teacher, I mean, but there's not always tension in between them. Sometimes it's about balance. Sometimes it's about, I don't know. Sometimes it's about overlapping and like the mixture of colors and things like that. But anyway, yeah. So I just want to make sure that we don't, I guess the way I'd say it is, if we read almost any verse in this epistle and come away saying, yep, plain as a pikestaff, that is, right, as Sam Gamgee might say, we're probably doing it wrong. We're probably doing it wrong. And so one last note on the plural we, because again, I saw some people still commenting on this, that is wanting to come back to verse 3 with the we and the you, and that the use of you in verse 3 would seem to prove that he's not being inclusive in with the we in verse 1. All I can say is wait for it. Hang on to that and evaluate it in a couple months and see what you think. I think that one of the things... Here's another way to explain what I think he's doing there. The first time you read it, you're going to read that we as outside yourself. If you were, listening to this epistle being read out, in the gathering the first time, right, you would almost certainly hear the we as meaning John's claim of apostolic authority, right, and his citation of apostolic authority. I think almost certainly that's how they would have heard it. But I think that the second time, certainly the fifth time, more likely the 15th time they heard it read, it would sound different to them. And I suspect that John means it that way, that he means for them to be included and kind of increasingly included as they themselves come to absorb and understand the message that he's saying here. Yes, exactly. That's exactly, Matthew, how I would say it. That the process of reading the letter, the process of gaining the understanding that he's trying to explain, slowly folds the reader into that we, even retroactively. Yes, exactly. Yes, even though on the one sense, like on a literal sense, that doesn't seem like it makes any sense, right? It's like, I mean, either they handled him with their hands or not, right? I mean, like one or the other. It's like you can't retroactively touch something with your hand, right? And yet there is a sense, I believe he is going to be asserting that there is a sense in which that's true. Now, having thought about the middle stuff, as I said, of verse 1, let's come back to the end, the word of life, right? The word of life now encapsulates not encapsulates, all of these things have been concerning the word of life. What was from the beginning concerning the word of life? What was from the arche? What was from the ruler, from the first, concerning the word of life? What we have heard concerning the word of life, what we have seen with our eyes concerning the word of life, what we have looked at concerning the word of life, and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. Think of that last one for a second. It's something very different to say, we have touched the word of life with our hands. That's a huge thing, right? It's a massive thing. We have touched the word of life with our hands. But he's not just saying that. He is saying that. But he's not just saying that. What we have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. You see? See the dimension that adds by doing the noun clause thing? You see the other dimension that he's added there? What we have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. That is, it isn't just the word of life himself that was touched and looked at and seen and heard. It was that which was concerning the word of life. That stuff about the word of, we have touched with our, that which we have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. Even if you didn't yourself touch the word of life, you will have touched with your hands things concerning the word of life. Even what was from the beginning concerning the word of life. Yeah, Randall, exactly. I'm a lot of what I'm focusing on here is really that that preposition peri, right? Concerning. Yes. Yeah. Anybody tell me anything about peri? About that preposition? How else is it used? Concerning, about, around. Its base meaning is around. Okay, so that's what I was thinking. Like perimeter. That's what I was. The word perimeter was suggesting to me that's what it was. About in several senses. Yeah, around the word of life. That's exactly. It's not. That's the sense that I was just kind of trying to touch with my hands here at the end, right? It isn't just, the word of life isn't just directly being touched with the hand, right? It's those things around the word of life, concerning the word of life. Those things that were from the beginning around, concerning, about the word of life. Yeah. And that is the another thing that seems to me to facilitate or to open the door to that inclusive we, that kind of retroactive inclusive we there. What is, on the one hand, a clear statement of firsthand witness account, right, is also relates to them because they have heard, seen, looked at, and touched with their hands what was from the beginning concerning the word of life, about the word of life. Those things brought about by the word of life, those things which were attached to the word of life, the things which were associated with the word of life, what the word of life brought, these are all things that they are, in fact, have encountered, right? Even though they didn't, presumably none of the readers of this would have met Jesus Christ himself in the flesh. Yeah, Hillary, I love that. Hillary says, I'm tempted to mentally translate it, the word of life stuff. Yes, it is the word of life, right? Concerning the word of life, but there is also the word of life stuff. I love that. I love that translation. Because that stuff was from the beginning too. Again, from the beginning in those multiple senses. How many senses do we have from the beginning? Well, just in the beginning itself, we had from the beginning of creation, from the beginning of the incarnation, right, of the gospel ministry, and from the beginning of the reception of the gospel, right, the beginning of their relationship, right, the reader's relationship with the gospel, and then thinking of beginning in the sense of thinking of arche in the sense of ruler, that kind of monarchical sense of the word arche, what was like from authority, right? What was from the ruler. That's the stuff, Hillary, right? The word of life stuff is from the ruler, right? Directly from the ruler. And we'll see lots of resonance of that as we move through the rest of the book as well. And then I like Matthew is adding a sort of another musing on that, on arche there. Most important, like first principle as well, kind of combining the big concept of beginning with the concept of ruler, right? Of most important. So like the most important stuff, right? It's the most important stuff, that which was from the beginning, from the arche. So that word of life stuff, super important stuff, right? And it's stuff that we've heard and seen and looked at and touched. And this whole the things of, or stuff, I think stuff is a really excellent, as far as I can see, modern English translation of this concept. That's how these noun clauses are working from the beginning. The noun clauses often have subjects, right? These are all, they all start with that relative pronoun, right? The whole there, which is being used as, being translated here in the interlinear, that which, right? It's a relative pronoun. In this case, in this instance, that which was from the beginning, that which we have heard, like that. It's not yet specified, right? The stuff that was from the beginning, the stuff that we have heard, the stuff that we have seen, like that. Those pronouns are standing in for something not yet specified. That's what a pronoun. Pronouns have antecedents, right? Pronouns are tied to nouns, right? They point to nouns. That's their job. When the first word of the whole book is a pronoun, right? A relative pronoun, then you're pointing to something we know not what yet, right? And that's the sense all the way through. The stuff from the beginning, the stuff we have heard, the stuff we've seen, the stuff we've looked upon. The word of life stuff. So there we go, Hillary. We've now established a new contemporary English version. There's one already called that. We've a new English version, right? The stuff that was, the stuff from the beginning stuff, the important beginning stuff, the stuff we've heard, the stuff we've seen with our eyes, the stuff we've looked at carefully, and the stuff we've touched with our hands. The word of life stuff. That's there we go. Okay, there we go. I was not thinking we were going to do a new translation of verse 1, but I like it. Good. Okay. Well, we are coming up on the end of our time, and as tempted as I am to jump into the parenthetical here to start off with verse 2, I've already peeked at verse 2 in that we can see that the bridge into verse 2 from verse 1, we're not going to be expanding on word directly, we're going to be expanding on life, right? We're going to come back to Zoe there. Cool. Anyway, all right, let's stop there. We'll continue next week. We'll see if we can do verse 2 next week. Maybe we'll even get into verse 3. Not quite so sure. We'll have to see. I agree, Matthew. We may need a whole week on manifested next time. So you can see some people The people who know me least well were laughing when I said I thought I was going to take that like a year and a half was an over-under. It was the over-under on how long it's going to take us to get through First John. Verse a week was pretty much what I assumed we'd be doing, and there are 105 verses in this book. So, yes, I'm glad you were able to join me, and thank you. This has been a fun discussion. I learned so much today. Looking forward to learning more with you next week. I will be here next week. March is going to get dodgy, but through the rest of February, I'll be able to be here every week. So I'll try to keep you guys posted for that. Thanks, as always, for joining us. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to you guys next week. Bye now.